Yellow and Red, Makes by Digits 27, Chapter 16. Naruto stayed away from Tahiya when he got up into the viewing area, making sure to keep Lee in between him and her at all times. He figured she might take out some of her anger on Lee before she eventually got to him. Honorable? No. Potentially life-saving? Maybe. However, she continued to confuse him by acting okay with the whole thing, continuing to send him smiles that chilled him to his very core. This was almost as bad as the punishment she was no doubt concocting right at that very moment. He tried to take his mind off of it and turned his attention to the fight at hand, only to see exactly what he expected. Gaara was wiping the floor with Tenten, almost literally. His various sand-filled attacks would send the older girl skidding across the arena floor. She would try and encounter with impressive displays of aerial and ranged combat, but ultimately it was useless. No matter how good her aim was, all of the multitude of weapons she threw merely embedded in or bounced off of Gaara's sand defense. Perfect aim meant nothing if something intercepted the attack. Eventually, however, impossible it may have seemed, the girl ran out of weapons. In this situation, she may have resorted to taijutsu or maybe ninjutsu if the situation called for it, but she managed to show great intelligence and humility by forfeiting the match. By this point, Naruto was practically squirming under the psychological torture Taiyuya was putting him through. He couldn't take it anymore and was already walking towards her before he really even knew what his legs were doing. Please, Taiyuya, I'm sorry, so just get it over with. Stop torturing me like this. Taiyuya just smirked at him, finally dropping the sickly sweet smile as she casually pointed at the selection board. If Naruto had been slightly more coherent, he would have realized that 16 competitors had already fought, leaving only him and the last member of Hinata's team. He groaned as Taiyuya smirked again, motioning with her eyes to the arena floor where the other boy had already made his way to. He sighed wearily. At least the fight would take his mind off of Taiyuya for a while, he hoped. He was grumbling something incoherent as he jumped down to the floor of the arena in a fluent movement that broke the impact of the drop. He walked over to the other kid, still mumbling under his breath before he was at the required distance away from his new opponent. He looked up and reaffirmed his earlier assessment of the kid. Average. There just wasn't anything remarkable about this kid whatsoever. Average brown hair, average clothes, average hair and build for a shinobi. It was like he was so average that it was a feature in and of itself. Unnervingly enough, he even smelt average, just with a hint of damp earth. He sighed and rolled his eyes. Hopefully that meant his skills were average as well. The other boy seemed to size him up as well, running his eyes over Naruto's ready stance and bored, distracted expression. Hey kid, what's your name? Naruto seemed to catch Mr. Average off with the remark. Huh? Naruto smirked. It was always so fun playing with people. Your name. That thing people used to refer to you. What is it? He spoke slowly as if speaking to a simpleton, and that only seemed to enrage the boy before him. What the hell is it to you? Naruto smirked again. He was playing right into his hands. I have a list of all the people I wiped the floor with, and I like to use names instead of descriptions. Once again, the other boy just got angry with the comment. Hibiki Saito. Add that to your new list of people who kicked your ass. Naruto smiled broadly. He couldn't help it. Seeing the other combatant so riled up was just brilliant. Not only would it knock off his focus, it would also serve to amuse Naruto as the fight progressed. What could he say? More than a few of Kyuubi's traits rubbed off on him, and Naruto liked to play with his food. Naruto's smirk immediately dropped from his face as soon as Hayate jumped backwards, initiating combat. Neither of them moved, and that might have annoyed Naruto if he wasn't as patient as he was. He had hoped to provoke Hibiki enough to make him initiate, but it wasn't a total loss. Now at least he had the opening move. He quickly channeled chakra to his hands, and the seals there that quickly appeared on his skin. Instantly, a kunai appeared in each of his hands and were quickly thrown in Hibiki's direction. Naruto furrowed his brow when Hibiki merely seemed to blur for a moment, and the kunai that would have hit his head and hard respectfully merely passed through him. Instantly, Naruto thought clone and whirled around only for there to be nobody there. He carefully turned back around, not letting Hibiki out of his line of sight. The supposed clones smelled like him. Clones weren't usually that accurate. And just to check, Naruto once again channeled chakra through his hands and into the seals on his wrist. 6 more kunai were ejected, and after each disappeared, he threw them perfectly on target. Each one merely passed through Hibiki as he continued to look amused at the display. Naruto gave his own smirk, not letting his opponent know that he was frustrated by this new turn of events. This time, he activated a slight different seal, and another kunai popped out in his hand. This time, he threw lower. The kunai still passed through Hibiki, but it embedded itself in the concrete a few meters behind him. The boy only heard them hissing in time to throw himself out of the way of the blast, and the exploding tag made. Naruto smiled broadly. At least he knew it definitely wasn't some kind of clone. His eyes opened wide, and remembered something Tayuya had once told him about genjutsus, and immediately clasped his hands together. Kai! He watched Hibiki get to his feet and the other side of the arena and laugh in a mocking fashion in Naruto's direction. No, it isn't a genjutsu, merely an ability of mine. Naruto waited for him to elaborate. When he did, Naruto dropped down into his taijutsu stance, down on all fours much like the Inuzako style. Hibiki also dropped into a more traditional stance with his legs spread for maximum balance and stability. Naruto rushed him, causing the other boy to momentarily gawk at how fast the blonde came at him, only to recover at the last second and blur. Naruto's fist passed straight through the other boy, but he didn't stop there. As soon as one of his hands met the ground, he used his hitting claws to pivot on a dime and send a vicious kick Hibiki's way. Once again, the boy immediately performed that irritating blur, and Naruto passed right through him. Naruto was beginning to piece together what was happening, but needed one more test just to be sure. For a final time, he spun on the ground, this time staying upright on his hands like an acrobat. He used his legs like a normal fighter, used his arms and lashed out in very punch-like motions. Each time he normally would have made contact Hibiki, just like that irritating blur. At least he did until Naruto suddenly stopped one of his kicks while it was still occupying the same space that Hibiki's head should have. He felt a satisfying smack on his leg that sent Hibiki reeling away from him. Clutching the side of his head in pain, Naruto gracefully jumped up from his walking handstand to look across at the now much angrier Leaf Nin. He had at least confirmed his suspicions then. So it's some kind of vibration? It was more a comment than a question, but Hibiki nodded, his eyes still burning at Naruto. Yeah, that's right. I can expel chakra from my tenketsu on either side of my body, moving myself enough to dodge blows and weapons. His eyes narrowed as his mouth once again molded into a sneering smile. It also has other uses too. Hibiki suddenly rushed Naruto, flipping the tables on him to invert how their match had begun. Naruto was now on the receiving end of a volley of quick and precise punches. He dodged them fairly easily, but he quickly saw the problem when he blocked an uppercut with his forearm. He flicked from the contact and had to jump back a few feet to see why his arm now suddenly hurt so much. He rolled up his sleeve while still moving back from Hibiki, only to see a large red welt on his arm that resembled a friction burn. Yeah, like I said, it has other uses. I can use the tenketsu on my arms to vibrate them so fast I can literally burn you as I hit you. Naruto tried to keep the emotion out of his face, but it was growing difficult to hide his frustration at this fight. He couldn't use thrown weapons, conventional attacks, and now even blocking was out. He didn't want to use any of his heavy hitters this early on in the exams. There needed to be some mystery later on in the matches to ensure his promotion. Okay, maybe he could let one go, but how was he supposed to use it? There was some rubble lying around from Kiba and Sasuke's fight. Yes, that might work now to get Hibiki into a situation where he was cut off from his planning as his opponent chose that time to suddenly begin attacking him again. Naruto was now rather hard-pressed. All he could do was dodge and occasionally counter-attack when he could. Of course, all of his own attacks were merely passed through the irritating boy. Hibiki had learned from his mistake. Now when Naruto stopped his punches and kicks midway, he would not only blur but dodge as well. Naruto, though, that he might be able to simply outlast the boy, his enormous chakra reserves might allow it. He threw that plan out quickly from this boy to eject chakra out of his tenketsu. In the amount he was using, he must have his own large supply. Even if Naruto's was bigger, the match would still be a long one. The longer it went on, the more likely he was to make a mistake that Hibiki would capitalize on. No, this needed to end soon. Of course, fate was in an argumentative mood that day, so Hibiki chose that moment to reveal yet another use for that handy-dandy chakra explosion. 1 minute, Naruto was fighting and dodging relentless attacks from one Hibiki. The next thing he knew, there were two. Of course, his natural reaction was clone, but when they both started attacking him in tandem, behind him, and he could actually feel the air move from both their punches. He treated them both as real. He jumped back for some respite, not that he showed how he was taking a breather with his confident stance and determined look. It was then that he noticed the blur both Hibiki's possessed, and it clicked. His eyes narrowed while Hibiki opened in amusement and mock innocence. "Oh, you only just worked it out?" Naruto snarled a little at the mocking question. "Use number 3. I can vibrate my entire body between 2 places, effectively doubling myself." As if to demonstrate the blurs on both boys became more pronounced as they seemed to merge back into one Hibiki. "Pretty useful when facing multiple opponents, or even just to corner one, if I do say so myself." Hibiki's cocky, invictus look turned into one of frustration as he finally noticed Naruto's smile. Naruto started laughing, a chuckle at first, but it quickly became louder, making Hibiki sneer from pure irritation. He half thought that one of his blows had connected, and he had knocked a few of Naruto's bolts loose. Eventually, the blonde settled down and looked across at his opponent, a large grin still plastered on his face. "You know, that's an awful lot of trouble to go through to double yourself." Hibiki's irritated look turned into one of confusion as Naruto straightened himself out. "Here, I'm in a good mood today, so I'm going to teach you a better way." Hibiki continued to look frustrated and puzzled at the lesson Naruto was giving him. He was so focused that he completely missed the piece of rubble behind him, suddenly hinged back into a perfectly clone of Naruto. "They're called the shadow clones." With that, the Naruto behind Hibiki thrust out his fist and punched the other boy squarely in the back of his head, knocking him out cold. The original Naruto smiled and walked over to his counterpart. They shared a high five before walking back to the spectator arena with their arms wrapped around the other's shoulder. Everyone was looking at him, shocked at first, then curious. The senseis and higher level jonin were especially riveted to him, wondering how a mere genin was able to learn such a high-ranked and chakra-consuming jutsu. Of course, Naruto's good mood immediately evaporated as soon as he emerged from the stairs to see Tayuya smiling at him. The shadow clone dispersed, and the real Naruto secretly wished that he could vanish like that. Well, he could, but that wasn't the point. Luckily, he was saved from anything Tayuya wanted to do. The winners of the matches were called down into the arena to discuss the placements for the real finals. The Sandaime Hokage and Hayate explained to them about the matches 1 month from now and their placement. The first match would be Naruto versus Neji, followed by Shino versus Dozu. That would be one side of the bracket, and the other side would be Shikamaru versus Lee, followed by Sasuke versus Gaara. The winners of each match would then fight one another until it was just 2 combatants, one from each side of the brackets. Naruto did some of the work in his head. That meant he would fight Neji, then Dozu or Shino, followed by whoever won on the other side of the bracket. He smirked. That would be Gaara. He smirked. That would be Gaara. There was little doubt about that, and he was glad. It would suck to have to fight Gaara either early on. It would mean less of a chance to show off the skills. He was sad that Tayuya wouldn't progress, but there were exams every 6 months, so she would get another shot in soon enough. Luckily, other hidden villages weren't quite so team-oriented with their tuning selection. It meant that Tayuya could go at it alone. Gaara and Naruto would be tuning themselves by then, so they couldn't help her even if they wanted to. He smiled as the finalists dispersed, all ready to train for a month in preparation for their next fights. He gave one last look at all his potential opponents, as that was what they were. In the end, he could end up fighting any of them. However, for now, Neji was his main focus. He would need to find a way around his Juken attacks and the rotation move he had seen. He figured he could talk to Hinata about that. She would understand his style better than most. As for the rotation, he was going to have to do some sparring with Gaara. If anybody understood an ultimate impenetrable defense, it was him. Next on the list was Dozu. The sound attack from his gauntlets were the priority. Naruto would have to damage it immediately. Shino may prove more difficult. He didn't fully understand how his bugs worked, so that was another thing he was going to have to find out. Lee was a simple one, a generic taijutsu master that would be fairly easy to overcome as long as he didn't have any tricks up his sleeves. Shikamaru was the mystery of the other bracket. Naruto guessed he He was the tactician sort of, but with only those shadow jutsus to back him up, his arsenal was hardly varied. Finally, there was Sasuke. Then again, Naruto didn't have to worry about him much as he would be Gaara's first opponent. He smirked to himself as he and Gaara rejoined Tayuya. This time, Naruto averted his gaze from the redhead, knowing that she couldn't unnerve him with that smile if he couldn't see it. Even so, he could feel her gaze borne into the back of his head as he walked, and it was becoming unbearable. He managed to stay silent until all three of them were out of the forest of death and were on the way back to the Inuzuka compound. He didn't know how, but he could feel that Tayuya hadn't stopped looking at him the entire way back. Finally, he crumpled and turned suddenly, once again, cringing at the sight of Tayuya's smile. "Okay, I'm sorry, Tayuya. I promise I will make it up to you, I swear." He quickly turned back around and dashed off in the direction of the Inuzuka compound, leaving behind a startled but pleased Tayuya and a bemused Gaara. "You enjoy manipulating him like that, don't you?" It wasn't really a question, but Tayuya smiled anyway. "Yep." Gaara just looked at her, his own smirk beginning to develop. "You know, some people would call that sadism." Tayuya beamed at him like he had given her the best compliment imaginable before she stuck her tongue out childishly and sprinted off after Naruto. Gaara just sighed, but his smile didn't diminish. Naruto wasn't the only one glad to see that Tayuya had come out of the whole affair in the forest unchanged. With the faint smile still set on his face, he too ran off after the two fleeting forms of his friends. A haunting melody drifted to the Inuzuka compound. Many of the Noonkin and their handlers paused at the unfamiliar sound. They turned their heads trying to find the source, but the music bounced off too many surfaces, making it almost untraceable. Naruto didn't need to trace it. He already knew where Tayuya would be. She always chose the same kind of spot to practice and play in, usually tall trees. He rounded the side of the house they were staying in to the tree where he did pull-ups in the mornings. Sure enough, there she was, sat up in the highest stable bough of the tree, with the thin metal flute balanced delicately in her hands as her nimble fingers danced across the air holes. The melody was long and drawn out, mournful yet not entirely sad, keeping him riveted as he merely stood and listened to the beautiful tune. Naruto couldn't believe he had agreed to let Tayuya drag him around all day. He wasn't exactly sure what he had done, but for this kind of punishment it must have been something bad. It was a scorching day in Suna. Even the most weather-hardened of the natives were preferring to spend the day inside. As it was, Naruto had no such luxury as he trapezed after Tayuya with a bundle of clothes acting as his repayment for the wrong. He had tried to get Gaara to come as well, but the reserved stand wielder had merely looked at him like he was crazy. Nowadays, Gaara used times like this for long, enjoyable lines. They had only been residents of Suna for 2 years, and Gaara's relationship with Shukaku fixed for less so. But Naruto and Tayuya already knew the winding streets like the back of their hands. They used this to their advantage as they walked through the most shaded areas of the streets and alleyways that would provide the most protection on a day like this. Tayuya may not have been girly in the traditional sense of the word, but she was still a girl. As such, most of the shops they visited were for clothes. Naruto normally would have been fine with that. Clothes shopping wasn't so bad. It was just the fact that half of the item they wouldn't even buy anything. Even so, and Naruto would happily admit it if it asked, he did enjoy the time with Tayuya. Recently, the two non-Wind Country natives hadn't much time along with each other. Again, that wasn't something Naruto minded all that much. In the few years they had known Gaara, he had grown into a fast friend. However, Naruto almost missed the days when it was just him and Tayuya together. He genuinely enjoyed her company. It didn't help at all that Tamaru would tease them to no end about their sleeping arrangement. It still frustrated Naruto that people would even bring it up. After all, it was private between them, and he didn't even see what the problem was. He was caught out from his own thoughts when he realized that Tayuya's hand had slipped out from his own. He briefly panicked, only to sigh in relief when he saw she was just gazing into a storefront off to his left. He wandered over and peeked into the store over her shoulder, looking at the strange devices and shapes that were inside. Most were made out of gleaming metals in various shades of their bronze or silver, but a few were wooden. He looked up at the stone name hanging from the door. It proudly read, "Instruments of Wind." Naruto didn't get the pun as he looked over the variety of musical instruments that adorned the various shelves and racks. He could see more than a few stringed instruments which only confused confused him concerning the name. He made a move to see if Tayuya wanted to move on, only to turn and see that she had vanished again. He spun around only to catch a glimpse of vibrant red hair now inside the store. When he followed her in, she was standing by a display case looking down at the various metal flutes that lay inside. She possessed a look that Naruto had never seen on Tayuya's features before. If he didn't know any better, he might have said it was awe. He looked over her shoulders at the flutes, not really understanding why she looked that way. Music had never particularly interested him before. She had one just like it. Tayuya shocked him by whispering the words almost overtly, a tone she never used in really any situation. Who? Tayuya jumped a little, as if she hadn't actually expected anyone to be next to her. Never mind answer her whispered revelation. When she saw it was just Naruto, she relaxed visibly, but bit her lip. She only did that when she was unsure about talking about her past. While they had certainly grown closer over time, there were things that they both still kept to themselves, especially considering their past. Back in Earth Country, there was this woman. Naruto could tell this was difficult to talk about for her, and unconsciously moved his hand to hers. She was slightly confused by the gesture, but appreciative nonetheless. Drawing comfort from Naruto's warm hand, she wasn't like all of the other parents. She didn't have any kids. Tayuya took a deep breath. Naruto kept quiet, allowing the girl to talk to her own pace. Well, she did, but she never told me what happened to them, but she always seemed really sad when I asked. While neither said anything, they both knew exactly what that meant, even if she hadn't at the time. One time, when my grandfather got really bad, drank more than the usual, I was scared, so I ran away. I don't know where I was going, and it was dark, so I kept tripping over things. Eventually, I heard music. I don't know why, but I followed it. It was the old woman, and she was playing a flute. She paused to look at the case again. A flute just like that one. Naruto could see she was indicating towards one of the plainer flutes in the cabinet, no less elegant or finely made than the others, but with only a single color and no engravings. It was rather simple. It was solid, made silver with a number of air holes spaced seemingly randomly along its length. He looked back at Tayuya, who simply stared at the instrument, unmoving like a statue. After that, I would go to her house and she would play for me. Said she didn't care what all the other parents thought. Naruto couldn't believe what he was seeing. A single tear edged its way out of the corner of Tayuya's eye and lazily dropped down her cheek. She made no move to wipe the offending droplet away, and it just followed the contours of her face before hanging onto her chin a moment and dropping to the floor with a muted splash. What happened to her? Naruto said it as softly as he could. Tayuya once again flinched when she heard his voice. While he liked that Tayuya was opening up to him and revealing more about her past, he definitely didn't like seeing her in this state. I don't know when I left. By now, a few more tears had escaped Tayuya's eyes, but not her notice. She profusely wiped them with her sleeves before straightening up and sniffing back that hadn't made it through her defenses. No sense talking about the past, though, shithead. She looked up at him, her usual defiant gleam back in her eyes, almost disappointing Naruto. Come on, there are a few stores I want to check out. You still owe me after all. Without anything further, she spun on her heel and left the store. Naruto's eyes darted between her retreating form and the display case that had so riveted her attention. A determined look entered his eye along with the faintest hints of a smile as he looked over to the bored-looking clerk behind the store's counter. Hey, mister, how much is one of these flutes? Tayuya's haunting melody finally drifted to a stop, so gently it was almost difficult to determine when the song ended and the normal sounds of nature began. Naruto hadn't even realized that his mouth had subconsciously fixed itself into a faint grin. He almost loved hearing Tayuya's play. It wasn't so much because he enjoyed the music, even though it in itself was beautiful. It was more to do with the fact that he could tell how happy it made her every time her fingers danced across its metal surface. Oi, shithead, you gonna stare all day like some kind of pervert? He chuckled to himself. Tayuya always had the most eloquent way of snapping him out of his various daydreams. He hopped up into the bough Tayuya was now lazily sitting on, her back against the trunk. She eyed him curiously with a hint of aggression, to which he already knew the reason, and before she could do anything, he quickly whipped out a scroll from his back pocket. Without further investigation, he channeled some chakra and unsealed the contents. With a flash of smoke, a plate quickly appeared atop the scroll. Tayuya's eyes widened a bit as she gazed down on the food on top of said plate. There lay an impressively large pile of dango, still steaming from being freshly grilled. "You got me, dango." Naruto grinned broadly. "Not just any dango. Your favorite dango." Tayuya looked at him speculatively, despite the still warm evidence in front of her. "You couldn't have? Hanami dango is impossible to get this time of year." Naruto just shrugged innocently, with a playful smile still glued on his face. Tayuya took one last look between him and the food on the plate before cautiously bringing it onto her lap. She only reveled in the dreamy smell that wafted up to her nose for a few seconds before happily digging into her favorite food. Hanami dango was notoriously difficult to find outside the sakura viewing season, more so in wind country when there wasn't even any sakura trees in the first place. Naruto stifled a laugh from Tayuya trying to eat with her mouth full, too busy shoveling down the delicious dumplings to care for trivialities like manners. She gulped down her last mouthful to make some room before repeating herself. "I hope this isn't all you got for me." Naruto shrugged as he went back to her food. In truth, he had hoped this would be enough. It usually made up for most of his wrongs. He just chuckled. This was why he always had a plan B. "Nope." Tayuya looked at him curiously, still with a mouthful of the snack as he motioned with his hand towards the Hokage monument. She looked, but didn't see anything out of the ordinary, or at least she didn't until Naruto made a hand seal. The Hokage monument seemed to blur ever so slightly for a moment. When the illusion dissipated, Tayuya nearly lost her current mouthful. "Do you like it?" Tayuya looked on at what Naruto had done as an apology with wide disbelieving eyes. All over the Hokage's face was bright, mist-colored paint done in random swirls. She even noted that the fourth now bore whisker markings not unlike Naruto's own, which gave them a strange resemblance. Naruto looked on at his female companion warningly, afraid that she wouldn't appreciate all the work that had gone into that prank. He let out a sigh of relief when Tayuya burst out laughing, just managing to avoid spraying her dango all over the ground below them. His own smirk broke out as he was allowed to revel in the unspoken praise of his handiwork. After a while of laughter, Tayuya just turned to him, still wiping the odd laughter-induced tear from her eyes. "How the fuck did you manage that, shithead?" Naruto just shrugged. It had actually been surprisingly easy to set up a large henge over the mountain. Well, he said easy. It was only his enormous chakra reserves that had stopped him passing out. The hard part was remembering where exactly he had painted already, so he wouldn't go over what he already done by mistake. Honestly, he had expected Ombo to swarm him as soon as he tried to set up the scaffolding. Maybe they just thought he was a cleaner. "Please tell me that's long-lasting paint." Naruto shook his head sheepishly, and Tayuya sighed. Naruto was a good prankster, but sometimes he just didn't take it far enough for her liking. "Nah, it'll come off with the rain." He didn't want to be offensive after all. He only did it to see Tayuya smile so missing accomplished, he guessed. "Oh well, nice work anyway, shithead." She motioned to the now empty plate of dango and the new additions to the monument. "I guess that'll do." Naruto smiled broadly again as Tayuya pulled him closer to her on the branch. She hated how cold it got here in Fire Country. It was just strange to her considering the name. They sat like that and talked for a while longer, only coming down when Gaara finally came looking for them. Naruto was glad for the momentary distraction and fun. The next month was going to be filled with training, and yes, training. End of chapter 16.